In this edition of In Focus, we're going to talk about a cold snap in relations between Russia and the United States of America. The past 6 months have seen the two countries adopting new pieces of legislation aimed at punishing human rights abuses and voiding some cooperation agreements. We will also examine the effects of relations downturn on Russian and American policies towards Syria, Afghanistan and Iran. Moscow and Washington have a long history of ups and downs in their relations. Years after the Cold War, Moscow and Washington went on to reset their ties in 2009. But whether it's cold or warm, America and Russia have an important relationship which affects many others in one way or another.
Since Vladimir Putin came to power, he has adopted a number of laws to strengthen sovereignty and independence of Russia. Some laws are aimed at organizations funded by the West, preventing their interference in internal affairs of Russia. These are necessary and totally legitimate measures, but the US thinks that these measures are contrary to its interests, and we are seeing a negative and sharp reaction from the US.
Over the past 6 months, relations between Russia and the US have seen a downturn. Both countries held presidential elections. In 2012, Vladimir Putin came back to power in Moscow and Barack Obama was re-elected for the second time.
Relations between Russia and the US continue to worsen. Many issues remain unsolved, including those around anti-missile defense. Moscow and Washington cannot agree on it, as well as on many other global issues, including Iran, Syria and even North Korea.
Relations between Russia and the US have always taken a priority in Russia's external politics. Whether we want it or not, America is a leading world power, economically and militarily. Media around the world is influenced by the US, so it would be a big mistake to ignore the US. Sure, it has difficulties, but it's one of domineering countries, and it's important to build relations with it.
When Barack Obama was declared the president of the US for the second time, the Kremlin welcomed the news. However, feathers were ruffled when Hillary Clinton declared that Moscow is trying to re-Sovietize the region through forming economic and trade unions with its neighbors. She said that Washington would fight Russia's efforts to boost its influence in the region.
Hillary Clinton
Integration process in the post-Soviet space will go ahead despite Ms. Clinton's desires. This process is driven by economic requirements of its participant countries, and that is a strategy of all the countries that are in this process. Whether the US likes it or not, this process will continue.
Vladimir Putin has proposed the Eurasian Union, which is a political and economic integration of neighboring countries in Central Asia and Eastern Europe. Creation of such a union is a priority in Russia's foreign policy. The Kremlin called Mrs. Clinton's comments a completely wrong understanding of integration efforts. At around the same time of Hillary Clinton's comments, the US Congress passed the so-called Magnitsky Bill. It allows Washington to impose a visa ban and a freeze of assets on Russian officials allegedly involved in the death of a Russian lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky. The case of Sergei Magnitsky goes back to 2008, when a 37-year-old lawyer discovered an alleged tax fraud involving Russian officials. Representing London-based Hermitage Capital Management, Magnitsky uncovered what he described as a web of corruption, including the alleged theft of more than $200 million. He was later arrested on fraud charges himself and was put into detention. He suffered from ill health and died before going on trial in November 2009.
The Magnitsky Bill imposes sanctions on Russian civil servants, government institutions like police, jurisdiction, etc. These are middle-class civil servants. They are not the kind of people who keep their money in American banks or spend their holidays in Miami. The law is out of context. It's just a way to mobilize public opinion in the US against Russia.
Indeed, the law was harshly criticized by the Russian president, who called it a politically unfriendly act. The Kremlin said it was a provocation and promised a similar response.
It's not clear why they even need it. Talking about a restart and yet making the situation worse. Whatever they say, Guantanamo is still open and they keep people there in chains and shackles on their legs without charges or trial, reminding the Middle Ages.
The controversial Magnitsky Law was shortly signed by President Obama, despite his opposition to the bill in the first place. Russia saw the Magnitsky Bill as a direct interference in its domestic affairs. The bill was condemned by Russian political elite and top diplomats. It wasn't long before Moscow retaliated with its own legislation, punishing the US for their human rights abuse record. The Russian lower house of parliament, the State Duma, passed a law on taking measures against US citizens who violate the rights of Russian citizens. The law imposes a visa ban and asset freeze against anyone involved in human rights abuse and unfair sentencing of Russians abroad.
It is important to protect our citizens who live abroad. Sadly, there's been a rise in cases of abuse and suffering of Russian adopted children in the US. The legislation would be a good moral support for our citizens abroad.
The bill became known as Dima Yakovlev Law, named after a Russian toddler adopted by Americans who died in a heat stroke after being left in a sweltering car for hours in 2008. His adoptive parents were found not guilty of involuntary manslaughter. The Dima Yakovlev bill prohibits American citizens from adopting Russian children. Around 60,000 Russian children have found new families in the US since 1992. There are 19 documented cases of Russian children dying at the hands of their adoptive parents in the US in the past 20 years. Russian authorities are currently investigating the case of a 3-year-old Maxim Kuzmin, adopted by an American family, who died in January this year. And in 2010, a 7-year-old boy, Artyom Savelyev, adopted by an American nurse, Tori Hansen, was put on a plane back to Russia with a note. This child is mentally unstable, he is violent and has severe psychopathic behaviors. I was lied to and misled by Russian orphanage workers and director regarding his mental stability and other issues. After giving my best to this child, I am sorry to say that for the safety of my family, friends and myself, I no longer wish to parent this child. I am returning him to a guardianship and would like the adoption disannulled. Around 3,400 Russian children were adopted by foreign families in 2011, with almost a third of the children going to American homes. The number of children adopted by Russian citizens was 7,416 over the same period. The law banning US adoptions in Russia was signed by the president within days.
We definitely should back up those initiatives aimed at doing our best inside our country to provide a happy future for our children, as well as the future of orphans and kids without parental care. With this regard, not only I am going to sign the law, but I also intend to sign a presidential decree on changing the procedure of supporting orphans, children without parental care, and especially those who find themselves in a very hard situation in terms of state of their health.
Experts in Russia point to an unfair judicial system in the US, which hasn't changed in the past 5 years, despite many cases of abuse.
During the last 20 years, adoption of little Russian citizens has become a multi-billion-dollar business. I think a civilized country should take care of its little citizens. We must not give them to other countries. In many cases of abuse and suffering, adoptive parents only get a conditional sentence or no punishment at all, while in the case of suffering of American children, their parents get a full punishment.
However, the law banning US citizens from adopting Russian children didn't receive the same welcome by some of the public in Russia. A number of protests was staged, calling for politicians to leave children out of politics. This is one of the bigger protests staged in Moscow over the past year. Tens of thousands of people have come here to show their discontent at the decision made by the lawmakers. The issue of adoption has touched many Russians, from young to old, who have braved the cold to have their say. This protest was staged on 13th of January. It lasted for several hours, with people demanding a change to the anti-Magnitsky law.
Demand for this law to be abolished and the State Duma dissolved. Deputies are covering up their greed with our most vulnerable citizens.
I'm against this law. I have a daughter and every child should have parents, even if adopted. It doesn't matter if they are American, African or French.
The protest was one of many that swept through Russia over the past year. They started with thousands of people taken to the streets of Moscow to protest against alleged rigging in parliamentary elections in Russia in December 2011. They went on throughout last year and culminated in May on the eve of Vladimir Putin's inauguration. The mass protest turned violent then and hundreds of activists were arrested.
We are not slaves. We live in the 21st century, not the 17th. I was born in Russia and I am not going to leave. We plan to hold more protests. We will continue our fight.
In order to contain mass protests, the Russian government signed a law which imposes a heavy fine for unsanctioned protests and demonstrations. Several opposition leaders have been detained and released throughout the year. And only recently, leader of the Left Front coalition, Sergei Udaltsov, was placed under house arrest until early April, when the investigation is expected to conclude. It was right here on the square, just across the Moskva River, a mere half a kilometer away from the Kremlin, that the majority of mass protests took place. They have since scattered around the city, depending on where the city hall authorizes for rallies to be held. But the protests are not always authorized. In a bid to avoid being arrested, activists refer to protests as public walks or gatherings when organizing them. The Russian government accused the US of fanning unrest in the country by organizing protesters. Experts say it was part of American foreign policy and aimed to provoke people against Vladimir Putin, who's back at the top for the third time.
The US is behind the process, not only in Russia but in the rest of the world, against current leadership. In their pursuit of global dominance, neoconservative US circles, which are acting within American administration and influence the president, the Secretary of State and the Defense Minister, and are trying to form American foreign policy. Bolotnaya Square protests in Russia and Arab Spring, they are all a product of and are used as weapons in American politics. What is unacceptable, though, is that some of Russian opposition groups are financed from abroad.
To address foreign funding of the opposition, Russian government has signed a foreign agents law in July last year. It forces all non-governmental organizations that receive money from abroad to register as foreign agents.
Non-commercial organizations that are funded from abroad have a whole range of instruments to influence civil society and internal situation in the country. First of all, it's a variety of political training for shaping people's minds. And in turn, they become sincere supporters of this idea, which contradicts Russian independence. Often these people are manipulated in the politics. Criticism in the society is important, but there's criticism aimed at solving problems, and there's criticism aimed at overthrowing a government under the guise of inability to solve problems. You have to understand what goals other non-commercial organizations and leaders of the opposition are pursuing. They shouldn't be allowed to influence these societies.
The US has been named by experts as the most active financier in Russia of such organizations. Officially, the US has spent $4 to $5 billion on Russian civil society during the past 20 years. According to the Russian Federal Financial Monitoring Service, this figure may only account for 30% of total money. This is because 70% are given out in cash, and that is not accounted for. NGOs undoubtedly play a role in fanning the flames of civil unrest. A Russian elections watchdog Golos was behind publicizing fraud that took place in parliamentary elections in December 2011. This revelation became a catalyst for anti-Kremlin demonstrations. Golos receives funds from the US and EU countries, but he denies being a tool of Western foreign policy. In September, Russia asked the US Agency for International Development to leave the country. According to its website, the US aid provides economic, development and humanitarian assistance around the world in support of the foreign policy goals of the United States. The organization has worked in Russia for 2 decades, spending nearly $3 billion on the so-called democratic programs. The Russian government accused it of meddling in politics. Relations between Russia and the US was strained during the Bush administration. However, former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev struck a warmer note with the US President Barack Obama. At the G20 meeting in London in 2009, they launched a reset of relations between Russia and the US and promised a fresh start. In March 2009, the US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov symbolically pressed a reset button. In 2010, the US and Russia agreed to reduce their arsenal of nuclear weapons under the New START nuclear reduction treaty. The reset was hailed as a success.
President Medvedev and I have, I think, successfully established a reset of U.S.-Russia relationships, the U.S.-Russian relationship over the last several years, and it has borne concrete fruit in the form of a New START treaty, a 1-2-3 agreement, the work that we did together in imposing sanctions on Iran, and most recently, the efforts that we've made on Russia's WTO ascension.
However, the reset was received skeptically by many experts in Russia. They say that there is a risk of the Soviet Union story repeating itself when the US worked with the Soviet leadership and financed dissidents. At the same time, Washington applied huge economic and political pressure with an accelerated arms race, which eventually led to the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Throughout history, the US has been practicing two ways to approach Russia. The first is the so-called partner approach. Here they say, let's develop our cooperation, we have common interests, let's work on them. But of course, under this pretext, the US is pursuing its own interests. The reset comes under this style of approach. American ambassador Mr. McFaul, who calls himself the architect of the reset, on his arrival in Moscow, said that one of his main goals is to use Russia against Iran and Syria. This is unacceptable for Russia to be used in US interests.
Anti-missile defense proved to be an obstacle in Russian-American relations too. Former US President George W. Bush signed deals to base interceptor missiles in Poland and the radar in the Czech Republic. Russia furiously objected it at that time. Moscow said it posed a threat to its national security and would take retaliatory measures.
I think that the policy for creating AMD is a strategic decision of the US which will never change. I think that the Russian leadership sees it as a fact and is working on its own methods of resistance. I think that Russia is planning this response through space and strategic missile capabilities. This year, 2 massive nuclear subs will start operating in autumn. They each have colossal military might, and as far as I know, 6 more nuclear submarines are being built. The US should beware of this now.
Experts are saying that both Russia and the US must make more efforts for their relations to improve. There's even been some talk of a second reset. However, experts are not very optimistic about the reality.
Since re-election, Obama's first official visit was to Israel. This is what's important for the US at the moment. There are no plans for Vladimir Putin and Barack Obama to meet in the near future. Postponement of their meetings indicates a further rift in relations. I don't see realistic reasons for relations to improve anytime soon.
However, ties between the Kremlin and the White House can have a global effect. Both countries are permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, and both have a right to veto on resolutions. There are many components to relations between Russia and the US. Russian ties with the EU and the Arab world depend on Russian relations with the US. When ties between Moscow and Washington are under the weather, it will have an effect on Russian relations with France, the UK and even Germany. The US and Russia have many disagreements on the international politics front. When it comes to Syria, Moscow and Washington are at 2 opposite ends. Russia is against foreign intervention in Syria, while the US wants the Syrian president, Bashar al-Assad, to go.
Formally, the US is calling for a dialogue in Syria, but at the same time they are pressuring their allies and partners. I think that the US is pressuring Great Britain and France in anti-Syrian propaganda. The US is playing double-standard political game in Syria. The US wants to look like it doesn't have a direct influence in the conflict, but they are training the opposition to fight against the government.
The US has formally recognized the National Coalition for Syrian Revolutionary and Opposition Forces as legitimate representatives of Syrians, and the US supports and finances it. Russia said the US is relying on the coalition achieving an armed victory.
Since the US started its aggression towards Syria, Russia has supported Damascus and Bashar al-Assad. This was a huge support for Syria. And that's why for 2 years now the US attacks on Syria are not bringing the desired results, even though the situation in Syria is very difficult and millions of people suffering. Russia is playing a serious stabilizing role in Syria. Positions of Russia, China and Iran are preventing military aggression from the US.
Since unrest escalated in Syria, Russia has been calling for an end to bloodshed from both sides. At the same time, Moscow is calling for a peaceful dialogue to take place without external interference. Moscow has welcomed many representatives of the Syrian government and the opposition for talks. And it insists for all sides to follow the Geneva Communique signed in July 2012. Differences in Russian and American foreign policies do not stop with Syria. Russia is pursuing different goals from the US in the Middle East. Russia abstained from voting on Libya in the Security Council in March 2011, which led to foreign intervention. Russian diplomats and the president are a lot more careful now on their foreign policy. When it comes to Afghanistan, Russia and the United States are partners in law enforcement and counter-narcotics cooperation in the country. A lot of Afghan drug trafficking channels lie along Russian borders, and both Moscow and Washington have been spending millions of dollars on eradicating them. The US declared recently that it would be withdrawing 34,000 of its troops from Afghanistan by 2014, but experts in Russia are skeptical.
I see that the US government has been trying to install in Middle Asia, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan. So if they continue pulling out from Afghanistan and basing in neighboring countries, I can't call it a troops withdrawal. Especially that they are leaving behind trainers. If the US doesn't change its global approach, this troops withdrawal process will be only symbolic. There's a danger of confrontation again.
While relations between Russia and the US may not have a direct effect on some countries in the Middle East, the direction in which their policies go matters. While the US is making threats to attack Iran over its nuclear program, Russia accepts Iran's right to peaceful nuclear energy program.
For many years, Iran has been an ally and a partner of Russia. Their relationship was at a stalemate during the recent years, but that was the influence of the US. Now these relations are repairing, and now there are three big countries resisting the US influence in the region: Russia, China and Iran. That's why they are the main strategic enemies of the US. We have to remember that the main doctrine of the US politics is to prevent a large group of countries getting together that would limit global dominance of the US. We must be ready for actions against Russia, China and Iran by the US and resist them together.
When asked how they see relations between Russia and the US developing, experts are not expecting any big changes. They say that a lot will depend on America's internal politics and its economic situation. Growth of Russia's economy and that of BRICS countries will have an effect on the way Russia decides to steer its course. In this edition of In Focus, we are going to talk about a cold snap in relations between Russia and the United States of America. The past 6 months have seen the two countries adopting new pieces of legislation aimed at punishing human rights abuses and voiding some cooperation agreements. We will also examine the effects of relations downturn on Russian and American policies towards Syria, Afghanistan and Iran.
he has adopted a number of laws to strengthen sovereignty and independence of Russia. Some laws are aimed at organizations funded by the West, preventing their interference in internal affairs of Russia. These are necessary and totally legitimate measures, but the US thinks that these measures are contrary to its interests, and we are seeing a negative and sharp reaction from the US.
Over the past 6 months, relations between Russia and the US have seen a downturn. Both countries held presidential elections. In 2012, Vladimir Putin came back to power in Moscow, and Barack Obama was re-elected for the second time.
Relations between Russia and the US continue to worsen. Many issues remain unsolved, including those around anti-missile defense. Moscow and Washington cannot agree on it, as well as on many other global issues, including Iran, Syria, and even North Korea.
Relations between Russia and the US have always taken a priority in Russia's external politics. Whether we want it or not, America is a leading world power, economically and militarily. Media around the world is influenced by the US, so it would be a big mistake to ignore the US. Sure, it has
Moscow and Washington have a long history of ups and downs in their relations. Years after the Cold War, Moscow and Washington went on to reset their ties in 2009. But whether it's cold or warm, America and Russia have an important relationship which affects many others in one way or another.
Since Vladimir Putin came to power,
difficulties, but it's one of domineering countries, and it's important to build relations with it.
When Barack Obama was declared the president of the US for the second time, the Kremlin welcomed the news. However, feathers were ruffled when Hillary Clinton declared that Moscow is trying to re-Sovietize the region through forming economic and trade unions with its neighbors. She said that Washington would fight Russia's efforts to boost its influence in the region.
Integration process in the post-Soviet space will go ahead despite Ms. Clinton's desires. This process is driven by economic requirements